So, hello everybody. I'm going to start. My name's Mark Hunt, and I've got a very short presentation that I'm going to deliver, be about like 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to our speaker today, who's Susan Adam Naser, and she's very kindly prepared a presentation about how to improve your written manuscripts and tips and advice that will make it easier for you to write rather than investing lots and lots of time and effort. There may be some little tricks that you can use to make it easier on yourselves and easier for the reviewers when they come to look at your work. Right, I'm going to very quickly share a presentation and then let's see. Right. If you are, Susan, perhaps can you see my screen?
Yes.
You can, brilliant. Am I visible or not? I'm not sure whether I'm fully visible. Let's see. Right, okay. Let's see. Okay, so, right. So, as mentioned, today we're going to talk about how to work smarter, not harder. I'm the host, Mark Jeremy Hunt, and this is the second eCorrector webinar that we've had. And the first one was very successful, and this one we're really looking forward to as well. As well as being the founder of eCorrector, I'm also a practicing scientist. I've worked for many years in research. I've got a ResearchGate profile, so if you're interested to know more about what I do, you can find it there. I'm mostly based at the Nensky Institute. That's in Poland. I've been there for many years now, and that's where I do my research. But I've been associated with many other universities in my history. About 7 or 8 years ago, I founded the company eCorrector. The idea is that it's actually providing a service specifically for scientists, and the providers are also scientists who are very familiar with how to write scientific papers, how to deal with responses from reviewers. And that's really the rationale behind eCorrector. It's a proofreading and scientific editing company. We work with a number of different specialists. We're very pleased to have Susan, as I mentioned today. Most of them are based in the UK or US, and they've got their PhDs from a number of good universities. We work with people from all areas of science, all academic areas, from genetics, theology, law, management, of course, chemistry, a number of different areas. And we work with a number of medical doctors as well. We are mainly focused in Poland. These are some of the institutes and the journals also that we provide editing and proofreading for, but also we work with institutes outside of Poland, in particularly Italy. This is what I think is really amusing, two amusing mistakes that I found that you don't want to make if you're going to be writing in English. Of course, school is spelled completely wrong, and this on the right hand side was a typo from an American. I think he was running for the presidency, and he had a typo in the word America. It reads America. It should read America, but that was really amusing. Right. So back to the serious things. As I've mentioned, Susan Adam Naser is going to do her presentation. She's got her PhD from Johns Hopkins University in the States in chemistry, mostly on fuel cells and ion exchange and various complicated things like this. She did postdoctoral research in University of Grenoble in France, and she's been editing and proofreading texts for us for the last couple of years, perhaps longer. She's one of my favourite editors, so I'm going to hand over to Susan now. I'm just going to see how to do this. Stop video. Stop share. Okay, Susan, can I hand over to you? Can you share your screen? Brilliant. That's great. So I'm going to mute myself. If you've got questions, you can type them into the chat, or as Susan has very kindly mentioned when we were talking about this, if you've got specific questions relevant to a particular slide, just unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay. So Susan, all over to you. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Everyone can hear me? Yes. Okay. Yes. All right. Well, thank you for being here today. I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks for writing scientific manuscripts to hopefully help you work smarter and not harder. So that's what we all want. So first, Mark introduced me a little bit, but I'll tell you a little bit more about my background and what qualifies me to speak on this topic to you today. So my formal training in the laboratory was in chemistry, organic, inorganic, biochemistry, and catalysis mostly, with applications in energy and environmental science. So specifically, I got my bachelor's from Lehigh University and my PhD from Johns Hopkins University, both in the US. And then I came over to Europe, to France specifically for my postdoc, and was there for a couple of years. And since then, and even throughout that time, I've been working on scientific writing. So I have 6 articles published about my own research during that time. And just being a scientific editor, over 400 manuscripts for over 120 journals. So these have also spanned all types of science, not just chemistry. So if you are not in chemistry and you have a specific question, hopefully I will still be able to answer that for you. Okay, so just a brief outline and my goals for this presentation. First, I want to talk a little bit about what to do before you start writing. So how to think about tailoring your submission to the journal where you want to submit it. And then things to think about as you're writing. So how to present and organize your content in all the different sections to make an effective article. And then how to perfect your paper. So to revise and edit your own paper so you can amplify your voice in English and catch some common mistakes that maybe you wouldn't have before. And then finally, we're going to leave some time for questions from you, specific or general. Hopefully we can help you out. Okay, so when you start thinking about putting your research into the form of an article, your number one goal is to essentially help your research reach a wider audience, as wide as possible. And so essentially you're pushing back the frontier, the scientific frontier, if you will. Sounds a little corny, but if you're doing research, that's really what you're doing. So you want to get it out there. So specifically what you're going to do is take the raw data, theory, applications, your results, and conclusions, and you're going to organize them in such a way that your audience will understand it. So it has to be clear to the reviewers and the editor and future readers of that article. So if you make the editors and reviewers happy, your work will get published, and that's great. That's your first step. And then if you make the readers happy, your work will get cited, and that means it will get brought to an even wider audience. So that's great too. So throughout this presentation, I've put these little icons to kind of help you think about specifically which part of your audience you're directing that writing to. So the 2 types of readers, I'm sure you've been both of these types of readers. So we have readers in a rush. So that's people who search for keywords, they find an article, they want to find one specific thing in that article, and then they're moving on. And then there's readers who want more detail. So this would include the editor and reviewers who are going to look at your article in a very detailed way, as well as future lab mates who will build upon your work in your lab. So if you haven't gone through the review process yet, I just wanted to go over kind of how that works really quickly. So first, you're going to submit your manuscript to the journal, and it's going to go to the journal editor, who's going to assess it. And if they think that it's not really within the scope of that specific journal, they can transfer it potentially. And if it's not well written or not complete, they can reject it outright at that point. However, if they think that there's a potential that it would be a good fit for that journal, they're going to send it out to reviewers, usually 2 to 3, and then it will go through the review process. So that can be single blind, double blind, transparent, or open. We can talk about those options more later if you want. So the reviewers will look at it, try to find things that are missing, things that should be changed, and they will send it back to the editor, who sends it back to you, the authors. And then you will make changes based on those reviewers' comments, send it back to the journal editor, and they will say, okay, maybe this is okay, we can accept it. They might send it back to the reviewers for another round, or they might say, no, this isn't going to work for our journal. So hopefully we end up here with the accepted manuscripts, and hopefully a little bit of what I talk about today can help you get there. So one of the important stats that I found was that the rejection rates, depending on the journal, can be 30 to 90%. So that can be really high. So basically, my point is, don't be discouraged if your manuscript doesn't get accepted, because it's relatively common and you can always find another journal that is a better fit for you. There have been a lot of studies to try to find a connection between the acceptance or rejection rate of a journal and the impact factor of that journal, but none of them have found a reliable correlation. So if you want to go for a high journal or a high impact journal, then I say go for it. However, the open access journals do tend to have higher acceptance rates, and readers can access them very easily. So those are also a nice option. But basically, when you're choosing a journal, you want to basically weigh the scope and audience of that journal and the impact factor of the journal. So the editor and reviewers are asked to consider 3 main things. The first is the relevance. So is the work within the scope of that journal, and will it be interesting to that journal's target audience? The second thing is the novelty. So is your work representing a contribution to the field? So do you have new knowledge or applications or methods or something like that? And do the results that you present reasonably support your conclusions? Now, these 2 things I can't really help you with. That's on you. But hopefully we can help you with this third aspect that the editor and reviewers consider, which is the presentation. So is it clearly presented and presented according to the journal guidelines? So that's what we're going to go over today. This is something that not a lot of people think about, which kind of surprises me as an editor, because this is my guide as an editor as well. So once you choose whichever journal or whichever journal family, at least, that you want to submit to, you should go on their website and find their journal guidelines to authors. So every journal has this. It'll be essentially your map to preparing your article. So certain things that they can tell you. It'll tell you the scope of the journal, so you can make sure that your article is appropriate for that journal. Excuse me. And whether they offer transfer services. So a lot of the large journal families will have multiple journals within them, and maybe it's more appropriate for one than the other, and they will transfer it for you. They'll tell you a little bit about what the review process is like. So it'll name the whole editorial board, talk about if it's single or double blind review, and then what that means for how to prepare a title page. They'll also talk about the accepted article types. So there are various types of articles, each with their own specific structure and different components. And you can choose or make sure that your article also fits within one of these types of articles. They also have word limits in many cases, I would say. It'll also talk about the abstract, how to prepare the abstract, and indexing. A lot of journals now publish keywords, which will also help people find your work when they're searching. The guidelines will also tell you about any additional components that you have to include. A lot of rejections are because something is missing. So you want to make sure that all of the different components are there when you submit the first time. It'll also tell you how to format your figures and tables and how to formulate those captions. And finally, how to format the text itself. A lot of them have templates available, but they will definitely tell you the spelling style to use and how to format references and in-text citations and things like that. So the journal guidelines are super important, and I definitely recommend using them as a guide when you're writing. So I think most people know the main manuscript components: an abstract, introduction, materials and methods, or experimental section, results and discussion, and conclusions. However, there's what comes before the abstracts is the front matter. And this could include the author information, which often comes up on the title page, as well as highlights, keywords, and graphical abstracts, which all three of these are super important. If the journal says that they're recommended but not necessary, I suggest including them anyway, because they will all help the searchability of your paper, which brings it to a wider audience. Additionally, at the end, after the conclusions, most journals require you to include back matter, which could include a description of the contents of the supporting information, if you have that, author contributions and how to format them. One of the common ways is using the credit designations. A lot of journals are asking for data transparency, so you might need to include a data availability statement. You'll also need to include a statement on funding, and usually it's good to include acknowledgements. Here we have an honest acknowledgement section, might include mostly just coffee and also our moms. And it might be honest, but you can really just acknowledge other researchers who helped out or people who helped out with editing. And finally, you're going to have to declare conflicts of interest. Even if you don't have any, you should say that. Okay, so now going through all of the aspects. So what makes a good title? Your title is going to be directed at readers in a rush, because people are going to see it and decide whether they want to read the rest of the paper. So you want to use keywords. You want to make it a declaration. So avoid saying something like the study of blah, 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 or investigation of blah, blah, blah. You can just start right in and say what it's about. You want to avoid abbreviations and very specific, field-specific jargon and technical names. And then finally, you want to make funny or punny titles with care. Some of these can be lost in translation or difficult to search for, so they might not reach the audience that they're directed to. So just have some funny examples here. We don't need no generation. I think this was actually a paper on computational something or other, but I certainly wouldn't get that from the title, even though it's cool because it has a song lyric parody in it. Similar with this one, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, kinases say no more. I have no idea what that paper is about. Tells me nothing in that title.
I have to say that is a brilliant title.
Yeah, they're great, but
I just never seen something so funny like that.
Not so effective.
That's brilliant.
This actually, the final one is my favorite. I don't know if anyone's Harry Potter fans. Fantastic yeasts and where to find them, the hidden diversity of dimorphic fungal pathogens. This one's nice because it also does tell you about what's in the paper. Also, you don't want your title to be too short or too long, usually less than 20 words, but keep it descriptive. and to the point, and it should convey the important aspects of the work. And finally, I wanted to give one title example that's personal to me. This was my first paper that I published. And looking back at it now, I hate this title. It's so long and wordy and just confusing. So critical aspects of heme peroxo copper complex structure and nature of proton source dictate metal O peroxo breakage versus reductive OO cleavage chemistry. And I'm just exhausted looking at it now. So one of my regrets. But anyway, so I thought about how now with my experience, I would edit this. And so I would change it to this. Heme peroxo copper structure and proton source dictate metal O breakage versus reductive OO cleavage. And I think it's a bit clearer that way. So definitely take time and formulate your title. That's the lesson there. So what makes a good abstract? This is also directed at readers in a rush for them to figure out if they want to read it. This is your hook also. So you want to use the journal guidelines. They will tell you the exact word limit, but if they don't, you should just generally be concise. Usually less than 250 words is good. A lot of journals require even shorter. You want to use the past or the present tense. You can choose, but I suggest whichever one that you choose, you should use it consistently. So for example, this report describes blah, 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 or you can use past, we developed material, blah, blah, blah. Another tip that I would have for your abstract is to have it read by a colleague in a different department, because they will tell you if there's too much jargon, or if they will be like, oh, I have no idea what your paper is going to be about based on this. So kind of an outline to follow when you're structuring your abstract. You can give it a one sentence background to talk about the importance or the gap in the literature. Then one sentence to state the purpose of your paper. You can take a little more space to talk about your methods or approach, but you should be general in this case. You don't want to say we used SEM and TEM to characterize the material. You can say we just used microscopic methods to characterize, because you don't want to introduce a lot of abbreviations and things like that in the abstract. The bulk of your abstract is going to be stating your results. And in this case, you want to be quantitative. So give the actual specific values in results. And then finally, you can add one sentence to conclude and state the application or implications of the work. So then the next the next section is the introduction. This one will be mostly read in detail, especially by the reviewers who want to see their own work cited, by the way. You want to be relatively concise and focused in scope. This is where the bulk of your in-text citations are going to be. So you want those references to be relevant, recent if possible, within the last 15 years or so, and high impact if possible. And you don't want to cite a reference within a reference, within a reference, within a reference like this. Don't send your readers on a manhunt. And so with this review, you want to give specific results and inclusion and conclusions that were reported earlier in those literature reports. And you want to emphasize the knowledge gap that you're filling with your manuscript. In this section, you want to use the past tense for everything. So all of those reports have already been reported. So you can use the past tense to talk about them. Except for established facts, you can use the present tense. So just some examples. You say Smith et al. Developed a method for calculating the strain energy. But if you're stating a fact, you can say just pressurized reactors can be used to prepare layered materials. Additionally, something that I see often is that people use the last paragraph of the introduction to give an outline of the paper. And this really isn't necessary because the structure of a paper is pretty standard, introduction, methods, results, conclusions. So you don't have to say in section 2, we talk about the methods that we use. In section 3, we talk about results. it's better just to restate the purpose of your paper. This was a comment that I really liked about the experimental section. So it's because it's so true. So when you're doing research, it's really 90% hard work and 10% results if you're lucky. But when you're writing about research, everyone focuses on writing about the results, and very little effort goes into writing about all that hard work and how you did it. So it's unfortunate, but that's how it is. But nevertheless, you definitely want to pay attention when you're writing your experimental section, because details are so important in this section. So that is details on the materials. So that could be your reagents, solvents, other materials, details on the equipment. So that's all the instrumentation used to perform the experiment or measure different products, and also details on the procedures. So these are all the processes that you use, how the experiments and the syntheses were all carried out. So essentially, the reader should have everything that they need to replicate your work and obtain the same results. So in this section, people are going to be reading for details. So think of your future lab mates who will use this to build on their own research. So the importance of the experimental section is that it validates your methods and allows others to build on your research. If you're repeating previous experiments, you definitely shouldn't just not say anything about them. Instead, you can just make a statement, we synthesized this compound, and add a citation. In this section, you want to use the past tense. So for example, the catalyst was added to the mixture and stirred, or X-ray diffraction was used to characterize. Things like that. You can also use the supporting information if it gets to be too much. So for example, crystal structure, coordinates, and computations that are complex. This is also where a lot of abbreviations tend to come up. So I wanted to say a little something about abbreviations. You want to define them at the first use in the main text. This is not including the abstract. And the way that you want to do that is with the abbreviation in parentheses. So like the top example, we use X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, XPS in parentheses to blah, 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 rather than putting the abbreviation in the main text and the definition in parentheses. Even when journals ask for an abbreviations list, you also want to define them in the text. So once they're defined, you want to use them consistently throughout the paper. And there's no need to define abbreviations that you only use once. In that case, you can just write out the term that one time. And finally, you don't want to use abbreviations in headings or figures and table captions, especially before they have been defined in the text, and you don't want to define them in those captions. So one example that I see a lot is people use the abbreviation FIG for figure. But if you're starting a sentence, you want to write out the full term, and that goes for all abbreviations. In general, try not to start a sentence with an abbreviation. Okay, so here's the interesting part, right? Presenting results in discussion. You're going to get all types of readers looking at this section, so it's very important. Specifically, the reviewers are looking for the comprehensiveness of your work and do the results reasonably support the conclusions. And just a note, it's a good idea to avoid spurious or invalid correlations. So here's another nice example. You can see this data seems to be correlated, positively correlated. But if you look at the axes, this is a correlation between a country's annual per capita chocolate consumption and the number of Nobel laureates per 10 million people. So it's very unlikely that those two things are actually correlated or related to one another. But in any case, you would definitely need more explanation or more data to support that. So you don't want to just make such correlations and not back them up. This section, you want to be mostly past tense. So something like this first example, the oxygen evolution rate increased when the catalyst was added. However, when you're referring to figures, that will be in the present tense. So you say the plot in figure 1 reveals a correlation coefficient of 0.791. Since those figures are in the current report, so you refer to them in the present tense. It's being more and more adopted to use the active voice. So, for example, the previous trend was the passive voice, like the catalyst was tested, but now it's a little more, or becoming more common to see the active voice. So you can say, we tested the catalyst. So it's more direct and more concise, which is always good. So there's, I'm going to talk a lot more about tips on wording and phrasing later, and I have some tips on figures as well if we have time. So finally, how to conclude. This is another section that readers in a rush will flock to. Conclusion section is required by most journals, but even if it's not required, I suggest including a few concluding sentences at least. So the 3 main things that you want to include in the conclusions, you want to restate the purpose of your work, summarize your findings, again, be quantitative in this, and then state the implications of the work. You can mention applications and future work. A lot of reviewers like to see this. And if you do, I suggest using the phrase, blah, 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 studies on this topic are ongoing in our laboratory. Kind of leaves it open, but lets them know that there's more work to be done. And finally, you want to structure this like a bulleted list, but without bullets. I see a lot of people using bullets in this section, but it's better to just formulate it as a paragraph. You can write it out in bullets and then kind of just take them out, and that would be fine usually. And additionally, in the conclusions, you want to use the past tense. So like, we found that blah, blah, blah. Except when you're mentioning the future directions. Okay, so I've talked a little bit throughout, but I wanted to summarize the use of different tenses in the different sections. So in the abstract, you can use either past or present tense as long as you're consistent within the abstract. In the introduction, you're discussing previously published work, so you want to use the past tense. So Lee et al. Reported or proposed or developed. In the experimental section, you're discussing things that you, experiments that you performed. So again, you want to use the past tense. So for example, compound 2 was added to the mixture. In the results and discussion, when you're discussing those results and relationships, you want to use mostly the past tense. So we observed, or this factor influenced, blah, blah, blah. However, the exception to this is when you're talking about referring to figures and tables. Since they're in the current report, you want to use present tense. So figure 1 shows this, or scheme 1 presents, blah, blah, blah. For general statements, as I mentioned, you want to use the present tense also. These are just facts. It seems that it is well established that, and state a common knowledge fact in present tense. And then finally, conclusions are also going to be in the past tense. So as you can see from this, in general, you want to stick to the past tense. So when in doubt, use the past tense. And essentially, you want to avoid jumping back and forth. So if you are using the present tense in the abstract, for example, just be consistent within that section. Okay, so there are 2 types of English, just to make things more confusing for you. You're going to want to check the journal guidelines. Sometimes they will state that they have a preference for American or British English spellings, but if they don't state a preference, then you should just choose one and use it consistently. So I wanted to point out some differences between these 2 spelling styles. So in American English, here on the left, they use IZ, IZE, and IZA endings for things like utilize, synthesize, characterization. whereas the British English will use ISE and ISA endings in those words. Similarly, with catalyze and analyze, American English uses YZE, and British English uses YSE. For words like behavior and neighbor, ending with OR or IOR, in American English, the British English will use IOUR or OUR, respectively. And finally, with center and fiber, American English uses RER, and British English uses RE. And then these ones are a little tricky because a lot of the, or they won't be caught by your spell checker, essentially. So some words, it's confusing too, some words that end in L, such as model, get a double L when in British English when you add ing or ed endings. So that's a tricky one. I would Google it if you're unsure. The final difference between these two is that the serial comma or the Oxford comma is not typically used in UK English, despite the nickname, the Oxford comma. However, I recommend always using it for clarity. And if you're not sure what this is, the serial comma is basically a comma added before the word and if you are listing 3 or more things. So an example of why I use it always, depending or regardless of which spelling style I'm using, is this sentence. So I love my parents, Taylor Swift, and George Clooney. So this sentence has an Oxford comma before and after Taylor Swift, and it clearly shows that the person, I love my parents, 3 things, my parents, Taylor Swift, and George Clooney. However, there's a little confusion. If you leave out that comma, it completely changes the meaning of the sentence. So it changes to, I love my parents, Taylor Swift, and George Clooney. So in this case, it implies that my parents are Taylor Swift and George Clooney. And I don't think anyone can say that, unfortunately. Okay. So I wanted to go over some phrasing and word choice, common mistakes and tips. This was another comic that I liked. If you don't know, you should definitely look up PhD comics. They're very relatable. So yeah, this one's just talking about you should never say you have problems in academia, call them challenges or issues. But as we know, all PhD students, and I guess it doesn't stop at PhD students, but we all have problems. We have issues, I should say. So when you're choosing your words, you want to be assertive, but not too showy. One of the examples that I see a lot is the use of the word proves. So you can see this observation proves that blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit emotional in English. So I would stick to something that's more like the results indicate or demonstrate or even confirm if you're trying to say proves. I would replace it with one of these options. Another one that I see is obviously, blah, 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 saying that like it's clear that this result means this. However, obviously is a little bit condescending, or it can be in English. I'm sure that's not how anyone means it. But in this case, it's better to just say clearly, or it is clear that whatever you're saying, or you can just completely remove that and just state what it is. And the reader will understand that it's clear that that's what it is. Another thing that I see a lot is remarkably or surprisingly, which are also, I guess, a little emotional. It's hard to explain. But these I suggest replacing with notably or importantly or interestingly, which are a little more direct. And finally, these some of these words have actually been specified by journals that they don't want you to use them. Things like novel, innovative, and unique, because of course everyone wants to say, oh, this is a novel or innovative process. So yeah, they were just being very overused. So it's better not to use those. Instead, you can say the developed method or the applied approach. Usually those will do the trick. And additionally, if you're saying, oh, this is the first time that this has been done, it's best to assume that you haven't read every single paper ever. So it's always good to send to add the disclaimer to our knowledge. So you can say, to our knowledge, this is the first example of blah, 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 whatever you're doing. Another thing, you want to vary your word choice. So you don't want to say, for example, in the introduction, if you're talking about a lot of studies, you don't want to say Jones et al. Found this, Smith et al. Found this. So you want to mix it up a little bit. So in this case, you can use found or proposed or developed or studied or tested or investigated. Similarly, if you get to your experimental or results section, you can say we evaluated, we analyzed, we assessed, we investigated, and then this result showed or indicated or suggested or demonstrated. And finally, this parameter impacted or affected or influenced something else. So essentially just mix it up a little bit. You can use a thesaurus as a good tool for that. The other thing is you want to avoid vague word choice. So you want to ensure clarity by being specific. So instead of saying the substance or the product, unless it was clear from the previous sentence, you want to name that substance or name that product. So for example, complex 2 was blah, 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 or the generated CO2 or the generated whatever the product was. Same goes for processes. So you don't want to just say this process was effective, blah, blah, blah. You want to say specifically what that process was to avoid confusion. Another way that you can ensure clarity is by being quantitative. That means giving values when possible, even if they're in a figure or table. So for example, you can instead of saying the peak position changed relative to the control sample, it would be better to say the peak was blue shifted relative to the control sample. So you say exactly how it changed relative to the control sample. This was an interesting one. So the use of improved and enhanced can be a little bit tricky or vague. So in this first sentence, we have the treatment improved the electrical resistivity of the conductor. So if you know anything about conductors, you know that a good conductor has low electrical resistivity. So improving the electrical resistivity would actually be reducing the electrical resistivity. So but if you read that first sentence, the treatment improved the electrical resistivity of the conductor, if you're not familiar, your mind would go to, okay, improved increased the electrical resistivity. So instead, you want to be specific and say it reduced the electrical resistivity. Go back quickly. The one case where I think it's always safe to use improved or enhanced is when you're talking about the performance. So there's no case where improving the performance means that the performance is going down. So I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit complicated, but I can go over some more examples afterwards if that's confusing. So this is another one. When you say with, if you're describing a relationship and you say, okay, the reaction rate decreased with temperature. So that could have two different meanings. So that could mean the reaction rate decreased with temperature, meaning as temperature increased. So that would be this top option here. Reaction rate is decreasing with temperature increasing. Or it could be a parallel comparison. So the reaction rate decreased with temperature as the temperature decreased. So that would be the second case, which you can see as the complete opposite. So here, decreasing reaction rate is decreasing temperature. So in this case, when you're describing relationships like this, it's best to be specific. So in this case, the reaction rate decreased as the temperature increased. So in that case, it's clearly discussing this top option. Okay, some more common mistakes that I see a lot is the use of the word respectively. So I'll see something like this first case, the rate constants reach 1.2, 3.7, and 5.1 for the studied complexes respectively. And really, when you use respectively, it should be when you have two lists with equal numbers of members. So like in this second case, the rate constants reached 1.2, 3.7, and 5.1 for complex 1, complex 2, and complex 3, respectively. So the use of respectively here relates the first item in each list to each other. So 1.2 is the rate for complex 1, 3.7 is for complex 2, and 5.1 is for complex 3. Another thing is the use of approximately. So a lot of times I'll see the maximum activity was observed at about or around 500 K. And both of these words can have alternative meanings. So when you're using them to mean approximately, it's better to just use approximately. So in this case, it would be the maximum activity was observed at approximately 500 K. Another thing that's a common mistake that I see is when you're comparing and contrasting, it should always be compared with this. We compared with, I think of an example, compared with the control, the developed catalyst was better or something. Or it can be relative to the control, the catalyst performed better, but it should not be compared to. So that is compared with or relative to, but not compared to, essentially. The other thing, you don't want to use, or you want to avoid using to be. So instead of saying the rate was calculated to be 9.2, it's better to just take that out, be more concise. The rate was 9.2. It means the same thing, and you reduce your words and make it more direct. Also, this is a really common one. I make this one myself. The use of due to is actually very specific, although it's used very widely. So the rule is basically if you can replace due to with caused by, then it's fine. You can keep it. But if it's better as because of, then you should change it to because of, because then in that case, due to is incorrect. So the examples here, so the rate increased due to the increased availability of active sites. So if we, replace this with caused by, we have the rate increased caused by the increased availability of active sites. That doesn't sound right. So in this case, it should be because of. But a correct use of due to would be the second sentence here. The faster reaction rate was due to the availability, or it was caused by the availability of additional active sites. And finally, in lists, you want to avoid using etc., et cetera, because this can cause some confusion with punctuation, capitalization, where the list ends, and things like that. So instead of saying numerous characterization techniques can be applied, such as SEM, TEM, XRD, et cetera, you can either put that in parentheses with EG, for example, or you can use, this is another possibility, numerous characterization techniques can be applied, including SEM, XRD, TEM, and XRD, among others. So that would be the clearer way to end your list. And finally, you can often reduce redundancies and wordiness by removing phrases with of. So for example, at a temperature of 65 degrees Celsius, saying a temperature is redundant with stating that value with those units. So you can just say at 65 degrees Celsius. Similarly, something like we conducted a study of, you can just reduce to we studied. And something like the oxidation state of iron was blah, blah, blah. You can just say the iron oxidation state was. So yeah, when possible, reduce phrases with of. And then final slide on this, I want to talk about making it concise, using concise phrasing. You want to avoid having too many introductory clauses. So in this case, it's a little wordy. Therefore, as shown in figure 3, under alkaline conditions, because of the higher number of active sites, catalyst 2 shows better activity than catalyst 1. So you can put the important part of that sentence right at the front. Therefore, catalyst 1 outperforms catalyst 2, and then kind of add all of your conditions there, under alkaline conditions, because it has more active sites. And then parentheses are your friends as well, as I did in that example, just putting the figure reference in parentheses. More examples here. Instead of saying it can be seen from figure 2 that blah, 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 you can shorten that a little bit to as shown in figure 2, or you can just start saying what is in figure 2 and put it in parentheses at the end. But this doesn't mean you shouldn't use transitions to help the flow. For example, first, second, third. In this case, not firstly, secondly, thirdly, just first, second, third. Other options to mix up your word choice: furthermore, moreover, overall, therefore, thus, as a result, additionally, blah, blah, blah. I do see on one hand and on the other hand a lot. Maybe this is a personal preference, but I would avoid using those and choosing something else. So I have an exercise, but I'm running a little bit long and I want to leave time for some questions. So I'm going to skip through this. Don't look. If we have questions later, or if we have time later, I can go through it as a little bit of a practice. So just the takeaways from this presentation that you can apply to your scientific writing. Very important to think about your audience in each section. Who's the target audience for that? Readers in a rush or those wanting detail. Super important to become familiar with the target journal's guidelines. You can use these as a map and follow them closely when you're preparing your manuscript. And then follow the 3 C's, write for clarity, conciseness, and consistency throughout and within each section. You want to avoid time traveling, so mind your tenses. As I went over, it's best to just go with the past tense when in doubt. And finally, in case you have heavy edits from your boss or from a proofreader, or even a rejection, don't despair, keep going. Keep your head down and keep working hard. This I think we can all relate to as well. I know it can be frustrating when you see a lot of red on your paper or in your document online. But yeah, just keep going. So that's where I'll end, to make sure we have some time to take your questions. And if no one has questions, I'll go back to my exercise. So you can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. So I'll give a second for that.
Susan, thanks a lot for your presentation. So I don't want to say anything too much in case we've got questions from the audience. We've got quite a lot of people. I don't know whether the audience are mostly PhD students, postdocs, or what their background is, but if you've got any members of the audience have got any questions they want to ask or they want to chat, just it's a good opportunity. If not, I've got a couple of things I want to ask you.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I'll ask a couple of things. One thing it was very interesting. You covered pretty much all aspects of the content of the paper, and then gave the examples of substituting, words that people tend to use repeatedly that is something that I think is really helpful. When you submit a paper, how strongly do you think the cover letter should be written? Do you think it's something very short and snappy, or something that's quite comprehensive? Where would you go with that?
When I'm writing a cover letter or editing a cover letter, I think of it kind of like the abstract. So 1 page maximum, and you want to emphasize first the knowledge gap in the literature, and basically the novelty of your work and how your research is filling that knowledge gap. So you do want to mention your results, but I would say emphasize the novelty, because that's what an editor wants to see, because that's what they want in their journal. They want new and exciting things.
Yeah, I definitely would second that. We sometimes get papers, where people just write, please find attached the paper. We hope you find it acceptable for publication, and it's not the cover letters are really, good opportunity to sell your work in a short and snappy way. Exactly. Definitely, I would definitely go with that. What about, what would you say? You gave lots of different tips for word substitutions and things like that. And if we don't have any questions, then we can wrap up with that example that you were going to show. But what would you say would be your do you have like the biggest tip for people that are writing, even to get to, for example, when would you say is the appropriate time to start writing your paper? How would you know you're ready to write a paper? How would you know?
That's a good question, actually. So thinking back to my research days, it was kind of when you immediately once you think you have a story. So when you can kind of connect your results with an interesting conclusion. Because once you have that, you can start making an outline, and then you can see where the holes are. It's like what control experiments you need to do, and maybe what supporting information you need to find. So I would say the earlier the better. That always helps, I think.
Yeah, because research is sort of an endless process. So you never reach the end. So in that context, it's hard to know when do you reach the end for the paper. And if you want to go for the big journal, you have to. It involves a different type of approach, I suspect, to the smaller journals.
Actually, there's a question in the chat that kind of. A nice segue here, I think. Okay. Someone's asking about suggestions for writing a review paper.
Yes.
I think that's a really nice option. I think I just have it in my next slide if I can. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about different types of articles. But if you're looking for one specifically, you can focus on that in this slide. But specifically for review articles, you can write those at any time. It's a nice option if you want to publish something, but if you're just not having good luck getting results, and they can be very high impact. So it is a nice option. They kind of can vary in length. So it's kind of up to you, a lot of things. So there's a lot of flexibility there. So I personally published a review article, which got a little bit out of hand. It was very, very long. But yeah, I think it's a great option. And it also helps you become even more familiar with the literature in your field. So I think it's a great option. I definitely suggest it. A lot of times they're invited, but you can always submit it to a journal that publishes review articles. So I hope that answered your question.
May I just make a quick comment on that? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
I had, ages back, I published a review, and there's two things I wanted to say. One is that I suspect most of the audience are PhD students. So at some point they're going to be writing their dissertation, their thesis up. And the review of literature is often a good framework for trying with your supervisor to turn that into a review paper. Because essentially for your review of literature, it's very long. You've got to know the area thoroughly, and you have to write it. So in a sense, you've got to write a review for your thesis. But whether it's good enough to get published in a peer-reviewed journal is a different thing. But that's the hard work. Essentially, is done with your thesis review of literature, and then it's sort of the skill with your supervisor who knows the topic really well to work that into a paper.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because anything that can reduce your stress when you're writing your thesis, if you already have a literature review written, that's a huge help. Yeah,
and even if you're not got a review of literature at that stage, if you've not got your review published after that stage of writing your review of literature, then you can think you've got to spend 6 months, whatever, 3 months writing your thesis. Half of that might be on the review of literature. And then if you can turn it into a paper, it's really good. The other thing I wanted to say, which surprised me, I thought I'm going to write a review. It's on a very, very niche subject, so not a very hot topic. And I thought it's going to be very hard to get published. But I contacted a number of editors at different journals because I thought I'll be lucky if one of them says, yes, I'm interested in that. But I think I contacted 3 of them and they said, yes, submit the review. So if you are in the audience and you want to write a review of literature, make sure you've got a good idea for what you want to include. Get that in a paragraph and send that off at least if you've got a draft already of the work. When you're at that stage, send off a little short letter to a few different editors, because you might be really surprised that they say, yes, we'd be interested to look at that. Yes, we'd be interested. And that's sort of what you want to have in mind, because then when you're targeting a specific journal, then you can look at how the reviews are written in that journal and formulate your text and your content to the word limits, to the structures, to if you include tables, this sort of thing. So it's something from my experience that surprised me, because I thought a review, who's going to want to read a review on this very, very narrow area of research? But maybe it was because there weren't that many reviews out there on that topic. That must have been the reason. But
there's so many journals out there that you'll find one that.
Yeah.
And actually, just one more thing to mention about review articles while we're on the topic. When you're putting figures and tables into a review article, a lot of them are going to be taken from previous articles. So because it's not your own work. So you do want to make sure that you have obtained the copyright information. Usually this is very easy to do, actually. So if you go to the article where you're taking the figure from, usually on that website, there will be something in the, I think where it talks about how to cite it. And you can say obtain copyright information or obtain copyright permissions. Mm-hmm. And you just click that and it's like you get an email or just like a one-page thing that you have the permission to reprint that figure because the journal owns that figure. So that's something important. Good point. If you're putting together a review article. Okay, so a few more questions in the chat that I'll try to address quickly. So what tense must we use when? What tense must we use when providing detailed discussion of our results? So in most cases, your results, I would say past tense. So we found that this factor influenced this factor, or we observed, or something like that. I would say go for past tense in the whole results and discussion section, except when you're saying figure 2 shows. that. That's the only case where you would use present tense. Let's see. Sometimes I found questions in the title or in the main contents. Is that acceptable? I would say avoid putting questions in. Instead, you could say, instead of saying, I'm trying to think of one. How can we improve this material's properties, or something like that? If you're kind of talking about your purpose, you can just reformulate it as a sentence. I think that's more formal for scientific writing. So you can say something like, we aimed to develop this material, not is it possible or can we develop this material? Something like that. It's not a great example, but just to answer your question, I would say avoid putting questions if you can, just formulate it as a statement. And then, okay. What do you do when you get corrections from reviewers for the fourth time in a series and you start a little war of arguments? Oh, I'm so sorry that you've gone through this. But yeah, I've been there. A lot of times, so I've been in this situation where we were kind of back and forth with arguments. We didn't think that something needed to be added. It wasn't relevant. And this reviewer just kept harping on it. At the end of the day, though, I would say just kind of the reviewers have the power. I know it sucks, but they do. And if it's not going to like really ruin your paper, I would say kind of do what they want. I had a colleague that was going through this recently. There was a reviewer who said, oh, you need to cite this paper, this paper, this paper, and this paper. I can't believe you didn't have that in your introduction. And once you looked at those papers, you saw they all had one common author, and you're like, oh, I think this is the reviewer that I'm speaking with. But they would not let it go through that final process to get accepted before this person added all of those references. So at some point, it's better to just do what they need if it's not going to really ruin your paper. So,
Susan, I just want to make a quick comment as well on that, because I've been in that situation as well. A while back, we had a paper that we were submitting as a full paper. I think there were 2 or 3 reviewers, and there was one of them that was saying, oh no, it needs to go as a rapid communication, and gave good reasons why, but that basically meant rewriting the paper and getting rid of half the figures. So we weren't really too keen to do that. But the reviewer was quite, it was something that was, I think we'd gone through 3 rounds of review. And the way our approach was, it depend, our approach was that two of the reviewers were okay with it. One reviewer wanted us to change it. And what we said in our response to reviewers was that we basically put it on the editor. We said that 2 reviewers have not found problems in this particular area. This reviewer raises this point. However, we don't fully agree. However, if the editor, and we put it so that sort of the editor had to make a decision, if the editor considers it appropriate, we will make this change. If you say something like that, then you have to follow through. If you want to make it a little bit more open, you can say something like, we would like to know the editor's perspective on this, so that you're not tying yourself to if the editor says, no, do what that reviewer says, and you've already said you're going to do it, then you have to do it. Maybe if it's gone through 4 rounds of review, the editor will be very familiar with your paper, and probably be, there'll be maybe 2 or 3 other reviewers that have looked at that text as well. And if they haven't raised that concern, then it might be a reviewer being difficult. And I think it's fair enough to say we've gone through 4 rounds of review, we've corrected it, done all the changes that all the other reviewers have asked for, whatever you've done. And this particular change we don't consider appropriate. If the editor can we have the editor's perspective on this? I just defer back to the defer to the editor. The other thing you could do is, and I'm sure you've thought about this, is to compromise. And these days you can put a lot of things in supplementary data. So maybe there's a compromise if it's to do with a figure or content or something like that. Yeah, I just wanted to mention.
No, I agree. Making an appeal to the editor is a good option. And yeah, in that case, supporting information. It's also accessible to everyone, even if they don't have access to the paper itself. So that's fine. Okay, one last question. What is the best word count for a review paper? This really depends. I think some journals might have a specific word limit for a review paper. Some of them leave it open-ended, so it's good to check your target journal's guidelines on their website. But I would say it depends on the scope of the review. So if you have a relatively specific review, you're just kind of reviewing a lot of literature on one specific topic, maybe, as I have here on the slides, 6,000 to 10,000 words. That'll be about, I'd say 12 to 20 journal pages when it's fully formatted. But if you have a wide scope of your review, then I would say it can get up to, I would say don't go too much beyond maybe 30,000 words, because then it's like a book. But yeah, I would say it definitely depends on the scope. So, okay, good.
Brilliant.
All right, so I don't know if people are done, or I can go back to my example and leave it up for people who want to stay on the call, and others, you can go on with your day.
Okay, so, Susan, so let's do the exercise. One very last thing I want to say, because I've got a bee in my bonnet about reviews, that they a lot of journals, the editors, if you contact them, they are often quite open to getting review submissions, because they're often quite highly cited, which is good for their journals. So the reviews normally have got quite high citation rates after a couple of years. So journal editors are often quite keen to have some there, because more citations are better for their journal. I won't say any more. Let's do the exercise, Susan.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep. Okay, so this is lightly adapted from an editing job that I did recently. This is a 60-word sentence. So I wanted to just give you a second to look at it and see if you can spot a few changes that you could make based on what we talked about here. So I'll give a little bit more time, because it's a long sentence. It's very complex. Just try to pick out a couple things that you could change to make it clearer. Okay. All right, and then I'll go through kind of my approach to editing this and kind of making sense of it. So the first thing that I looked for, oh, no, it doesn't want to go. Oh, okay. So the first thing is some word choice aspects. So here, this appears to be something that was in results and discussion section. So we should be using past tense. So the first thing here, I would change this to achieved. You don't have the rest of the paper, so you wouldn't know one way or the other, but having an abbreviation here, if it wasn't previously defined, we would want to define it here. About, I talked about a little bit. it's better to replace this with approximately, if that's your meaning. Here we have dramatic, it's a little bit showy, and improvement could be a little bit vague. So we want to think about possibly changing these. Activity of, so here's an instance where we could potentially remove this of to make it a little more concise. And same here, as a result of, we can usually use because of or something like that. So the next thing that I looked for was agreement. So here you can see we have two parallel lists. We have two values and then two different conditions. So here's somewhere where we could add the word respectively to increase the clarity of this. Here we have some underlined in blue, just some extra clauses that we could put into parentheses theoretically to make it a little bit clearer and more concise. And then here I've added green slashes where we could kind of break up this super long sentence into 3 different sentences. So what I came up with out of this one super long sentence was first this: furthermore, Catalyst 1 achieved, past tense, oxygen evolution, OE, activities of 2.68 and 3.45 amperes per gram at 1.5 volts versus SHE in parentheses in neutral and acidic media respectively. So these two, this was the activity in neutral and this was the activity in acidic. So then the second sentence would be thus: the performance of Catalyst 1 was approximately 2.5-fold higher than that of Catalyst 2. And then we give Catalyst 2 values in parentheses. And here we can use respectively again in back-to-back sentences so that these then again tie back to neutral and acidic media in this sentence as well. So you can do that if they're back-to-back sentences, I would say. And then the final sentence would be, this distinction highlighted the increased catalytic activity following structural modifications. And then figure 5 in parentheses. So this is taking one sentence, super long, very wordy, breaking it up, making it much cleaner, I think, and breaking it into 3 different sentences. So hopefully you spotted at least 1 or 2 of those changes and you can apply them in your own writing. So I'll just leave it open for a few more if you have questions about this or anything else before we go.
Here, do we have to change the figure FIG.5 to figure or not?
That would depend on the rest of the paper. So in this case, it's not beginning a sentence. So you could write out the whole word figure if that's what you were doing throughout the rest of the paper.
Also, SHE is was not actually defined here, so we keep using SHE or not?
That's a good point. Yes. So in this case, it was defined earlier in the paper, so that's really good. I didn't catch that. But yes, if this was the first time it was mentioned in the text, then yes, you would have to give the definition of that abbreviation.
In first sentence, like achieve the oxygen evolution activity of, like you have to keep activity words in here also, like because the last sentence, the intrinsic activity of catalyst, you have to.
You could remove it.
No, sorry,
if it's clear.
wrong. Sorry, I just forget. Never mind.
So it's actually often oxygen evolution activity could be one term altogether or one abbreviation. So yeah, in that case, you could remove it if you wanted.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Yep, Susan, we should wrap up. Thank you very much. It's been really informative, presentation, and really nicely explained and answered the different questions. So we have to close the meeting. So I'm just going to end it. So thank you to the audience for participating with the questions and for listening, for staying to the end. Susan, once again, really enjoyed that. So we're going to end this now. So we'll update people when we have another presentation planned. And yeah, that's all. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening, everybody, and thanks again, Susan. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.